What if the man everyone called a monster was the only one telling the truth? Because in this story, the villain does not fall. He edits fate with his own hands. He woke up rich beyond reason, wearing a stranger's name, a stranger's tower, and a stranger's mistakes. His name was now Adrian Blackwell, billionaire, feared by an entire city called New Harbor. For about 10 seconds, waking up inside that life felt like winning a lottery nobody had to buy a ticket for. Then he met his son. Not a blessing, not a joy. A walking disaster with a broken leg and a talent for turning money into headlines. The moment he saw Tanner Blackwell screaming in a hospital bed, something else opened behind his eyes. It was not a game menu. It was not a joke. It was a ledger. A record of fate itself, written by whatever force had thrown him into this body. It showed him the story he was supposed to live, the mistakes the original Adrian had made, the death waiting at the end of them. The very first warning was brutally simple. Protect his son blindly, and his son would become the reason he lost everything. Refuse to protect him, and fortune itself would start paying him back. So he made a choice that old Adrian Blackwell never had the spine to make. He stopped being his son's shield. Before we go further, you need to understand who this man used to be, and why New Harbor feared his name before he ever earned it. The original Adrian Blackwell was a titan of industry, cold, ruthless, and universally hated behind closed doors. He built an empire on fear, then spent that empire protecting a son who did not deserve protecting. That original Adrian died under an overpass, crushed by rain, concrete, and his own blind loyalty. The soul that woke up in his place was someone else entirely, carrying memories from another life, another world. And stapled behind that new soul's eyes was something the old Adrian never had. A warning system. A destiny ledger. It did not explain itself with a 10-minute tutorial or a friendly floating window. It taught through consequence, through pain, through profit. Every time the new Adrian refused to play the villain's expected role, the ledger rewarded him. Every time he almost slipped back into old patterns, it warned him first. He quickly understood one truth about the story he had fallen into. Somewhere out there, a protagonist existed. A chosen man destined to rise, destined to be wronged, destined to inherit everything Adrian built. And Adrian Blackwell was written to be his obstacle, his villain, his death sentence. He decided almost immediately that he refused to die on schedule. New Harbor was a city built on old money, old grudges, and new cruelty wearing expensive suits. Everyone in it was afraid to offend a Blackwell. That fear had kept the family safe for decades. It had also let Tanner Blackwell grow into exactly the kind of heir who turns family money into public disaster. Tanner was not evil in the cinematic sense. He was worse. He was ordinary cruelty with unlimited credit. Spoiled, entitled, quick to threaten, quicker to cry the moment the threat failed to land. He believed the Blackwell name was a weapon he could point at anyone who inconvenienced him. For years, that belief had been correct. On the morning everything changed, Tanner lay in a private hospital room with one leg broken, one nurse cornered, and far too much inherited oxygen in his lungs. He had grabbed a nurse. A man from outside his social circle had stepped in and broken his leg defending her. Instead of shame, Tanner felt only outrage that someone dared to touch a Blackwell. He pointed at the terrified nurse and demanded his father destroy her career on the spot. That was the exact moment the destiny ledger opened fully behind Adrian's eyes for the first time. The rule was stark. Shield Tanner now, and the man who broke his leg would ride Blackwell money and Blackwell pride. Until Adrian died the same way the original Adrian had. Adrian walked into that hospital room already knowing what the old version of himself would have done. He did the opposite. He slapped his own son across the face. The sound cracked through the ward like a verdict. Every doctor, every nurse, every guard in that room froze at once. His security chief, a sharp, quiet man named Hugo Marks, turned so fast his coat snapped behind him. Tanner stared at his father with his mouth open, stunned in a way that pure money had never let him feel before. He said the same for words every spoiled heir eventually says. You hit me. Adrian slapped him again. This time nobody in the room even breathed. And in Adrian's vision, the ledger chimed for the very first time. Deviation confirmed. Points gained. Insight unlocked. No lecture. No tutorial, just pain, silence, and profit. That, he would later admit, was the most honest system he had ever met. Tanner's eyes watered, but his pride recovered faster than his brain did. He ordered his security guard to throw the nurse out for letting a stranger break his leg. The guard did not move. That single refusal told Adrian everything about how fragile his son's authority really was. Before that slap, Tanner had used the Blackwell name like a loaded gun. Staff jumped, guards obeyed. Doctors smiled through their teeth. Now every eye in the room turned toward the father instead of the son. The nurse's badge read Amelia Hartwell. She was trying very hard not to shake, and failing quietly. Adrienne asked her a simple question. Did you touch his leg? She admitted the truth. Tanner had grabbed her wrist. A stranger had pulled him off her. Tanner had swung first. Tanner shouted that she was lying. Adrienne looked at his son's wrapped leg and asked one cutting question. You swung first, and you still lost. The doctor in the room coughed into his fist to hide a laugh. Tanner's ears went red. Adrienne ordered standard medical care for his son. Nothing more. Tanner demanded something he called the private pain protocol. A rich family euphemism for excessive, expensive, unnecessary treatment. Adrienne refused. His son would get what the injury required, not what his ego demanded. Tanner reached for his phone and aimed the camera at his own tearful face, threatening to broadcast that his own father had assaulted him in a hospital bed. Adrienne calmly took the phone from his hand. He did not delete the recording. He archived it instead, timestamped, preserved, as proof that Tanner had threatened hospital staff seconds after being stopped. Then he froze his son's emergency card in front of everyone. 10 seconds later, the bedside payment tablet chirped red. Card declined. For the first time in his spoiled life, Tanner heard the word no from something that was supposed to always say yes. He whispered that his father had frozen his card. Adrienne leaned closer and warned him softly. That was one card. Keep performing, and I start freezing doors. The room changed after that. Not poetically, practically. The nurses stopped watching Tanner and started watching his father instead. One of Tanner's own personal guards was told to stay exactly where he stood, ignoring Tanner's order to remove his father from the room. That was not a dramatic betrayal. It was something worse. It was quiet. Administrative proof that Tanner's authority had already expired. In Adrienne's vision, the ledger flickered again. His security chief's loyalty had increased. A loyal protector, he realized, was worth infinitely more than a crying heir. Adrienne confronted his son directly. You are taking her side over your own son, Tanner accused. Adrienne corrected him coldly. I am taking my own side. You are just the idiot standing in the way of it. That sentence hit harder than either slap. Tanner had expected a father hiding a family scandal. He got an owner inspecting damaged property instead. It sounded cold, because it was cold. Adrienne had woken up inside a villain's body with a death sentence stapled to his soul. He did not have the luxury of becoming a better father to a grown man who treated nurses like furniture. The old Adrienne had shielded Tanner all the way into a grave under an overpass. The new Adrienne preferred staying alive. He demanded the name of the man who had broken Tanner's leg. Tanner's jaw locked shut. A brat who could scream for revenge but could not name his enemy was not angry. He was afraid. The nurse, Amelia, finally spoke the name herself. Luke Farrow. The moment that name touched the air, the destiny ledger stirred like a hunting dog catching a scent. Fate skin unavailable. Target proximity required. It whispered. Luke Farrow was not just a nobody who happened to break a rich boy's leg. He was, in every sense the ledger cared about, the protagonist. Adrienne did not send an army after him. That was the old villain's move. And old villains always lost. Instead, he asked one quiet question. Is he hiding? His security chief checked and reported back. No, he is talking. Of course he was. A protagonist without an audience is just a man with unresolved jaw tension. And Adrienne intended to give him exactly the audience he deserved, on Adrienne's own terms. Before he even reached that clinic, Tanner tried to prove the ledger's warning had not been dramatic enough. A nurse found him whispering into a borrowed phone under his hospital blanket. His security chief seized the phone and played the call on speaker for everyone to hear. Tanner's own voice came out thin and ugly. Get me to hitters before my father grows a conscience. He wanted the clinic owner sent home in a box. Adrienne looked at the ceiling, searching for patients he did not deserve to have. This was the son destiny had warned would kill him. Not with a weapon, but with premium-grade stupidity wrapped in a Blackwell surname. He refused the order outright. No street enforcer. No private retaliation. Nobody touches Luke Farrow unless Luke touches us first. Tanner laughed and asked if his father was simply letting the man go. Adrienne corrected him. I am not letting him go. I am refusing to feed him. In his vision, a new line appeared. A route deviation was forming. They drove to Hartwell Clinic in a single quiet security car. No sirens. No convoy. No parade of angry rich men. The old Adrienne would have sent 20 cars and a small army of bodyguards and sunglasses. This Adrienne sent one official police report ahead of him, and nothing else. Through the clinic's front glass, he saw Amelia near the reception desk, still in her hospital scrubs. Beside her stood her grandfather, an old silver-haired doctor named Samuel Hartwell. And leaning against the counter like he owned the building stood Luke Farrow himself. Younger than Adrienne, physically stronger, and smug in exactly the way Destiny loved to reward. Luke was busy telling the old doctor that rich families always panic the moment someone refuses to bow to them. Amelia reminded him quietly that he had broken a man's leg. Luke's answer was simple and infuriatingly reasonable. He grabbed you. I protected you. That was the frustrating part. A good protagonist always starts with one decent reason, and the universe hands him 10 bad ones and calls it justice. Adrienne did not walk in immediately. He waited outside the glass, letting Luke build his own stage first. Interrupting early would have been rude and far less profitable. Then blue police lights washed across the clinic windows. An officer named Dana Royston walked in, calm, sharp, and completely unimpressed by rich family theater. She asked for Luke Farrow by name and placed him under arrest for that morning's assault. Luke had expected a villain storming through the door. He got a woman with handcuffs instead. He mocked the officer, asking if she understood who she was helping. Dana's answer was simple. His son assaulted a nurse. Let the nurse make her own statement. Luke turned to Amelia, expecting her to defend him on command. Amelia did not plead for him. She told the officer the truth. He grabbed me. He also broke his leg. That refusal was the first real crack in Luke's confidence. The old doctor tried to smooth things over, calling it a misunderstanding that could be resolved quietly. The officer disagreed and asked him to simply step back. He did, slowly, but he did it. Police lights in front of a clinic turn every patient into a witness, and pride cannot survive an audience like that. Dana cuffed Luke in front of Amelia, her grandfather, to waiting patients, and Adrienne's own security chief. That was the part Luke could not dodge, no matter how clever his excuses were. As officers guided him out, Luke finally noticed Adrienne standing under the clinic awning. His expression shifted from confidence to something closer to offended recognition. In every story like this one, the villain is supposed to storm in first, before the hero is ever caught. Adrienne had arrived after the handcuffs were already on. That felt, to Luke, like cheating in the most legal way possible. In Adrienne's vision, the ledger finally locked onto its target. Fate scum proximity acquired. Protagonist identified. Route interrupted. There he was, the man the story had written to challenge Adrienne and steal everything he built. Luke tried one last threat through the departing officer, promising this was not over. Adrienne's reply was short. Good. I hate wasting gas. The cruiser door shut on Luke's glare, and the first battle of the day ended in a small, clean, undramatic victory. That night, a different stage waited at the police station, and Luke Farrow believed it belonged to him. He sat behind interview glass with one cuff still looped to the table, certain his moment for a comeback speech had arrived. Adrienne walked straight past him without a single glance and spoke only to the officer instead. That silence hurt Luke more than any insult could have. A punch would have fed him. Silence starved him. Luke slammed his hand on the table, shouting for attention like a man convinced the world still owed him a spotlight. Adrienne answered without even turning his head. I heard furniture make noise, too. I do not answer chairs. The old doctor tried to plead for leniency, reminding Adrienne that Luke had, after all, protected his granddaughter. Adrienne reminded him just as plainly that the clinic had also hidden the man responsible for his son's injury, and nobody had been punished for that either. He warned the old man not to spend his mercy faster than it could be counted. Then, in front of the officer, the nurse, and the old doctor, Adrienne named his price for letting Luke walk free. One apology, spoken aloud, in person, to the people Luke had used. Luke laughed at the idea, insisting he needed no one's permission to walk out of that station. The officer corrected him gently. He needed a lawful argument first, and right now nobody in the room was offering one. Luke lashed out, calling Tanner trash in front of everyone, expecting Adrienne to deny it and lose composure. Adrienne agreed instead. Correct, Tanner is trash, but he is my trash. You do not get to build a throne out of him. That answer landed strangely in the room. Luke had expected denial. He received ownership instead, and it cost him his footing. Behind the scenes, a security photograph surfaced, a worn pendant found in Luke's belongings, marked with the crest of the powerful Moreland family. It meant Luke was not simply protected by luck. He carried an old family favor, like a prepaid credit card waiting to be spent. That, Adrienne realized, was the real threat. Destiny did not need to break the law. It only needed one arrogant man leaning on an old promise. A dinner was arranged that evening between the Blackwell and Moreland families, with Luke's freedom as the unspoken agenda. Robert Moreland arrived at Blackwell Tower early, along with his daughter, a cold, sharp woman named Juliet. Juliet did not soften the room with charm. She looked at the paused video clip of Tanner's tantrum still playing on the wall screen, and asked if this was really how Blackwell Capital prepared for a simple dinner. Adrian respected the efficiency of that insult more than he resented it. Robert explained that his own father, Leonard Moreland, believed Luke deserved a door opened before his future was ruined. Juliet disagreed instantly, reminding her father that Luke was not a helpless boy, but a grown man who kept hiding behind other people's debts. Adrian's condition for the dinner stayed simple: one public apology, honest enough to satisfy the people Luke had wronged. That evening, in a private room at the Crown Meridian Hotel, $500 million in business sat on the table beside a single typed sentence of apology. Luke walked in with false confidence restored, wearing borrowed courage like a rented suit. Juliet's father slid the apology card toward him, plain, honest, without legal tricks. Read it, mean it if you can, and sit down. Luke refused to touch it at first, accusing the room of dragging him there to be humiliated. A 60-second timer began counting down while Luke stalled, insulted his host, and finally tore the apology card in half. The paper ripped louder than it should have, and the room went cold around him. Robert Moreland stood, furious that his own table had been used to threaten his daughter in front of witnesses. Then, without warning, Robert's hand slipped, his wine glass tipped, his knees buckled. He collapsed to the floor. Luke's eyes lit with sudden opportunity. A collapsed billionaire, right after his own apology had failed, felt like a gift-wrapped rescue scene. He stepped forward, declaring himself a doctor, demanding the room clear a path for his miracle. Adrian stood between them instead, refusing to move. He had noticed something Luke had not: an amber tonic bottle beside Robert's plate, glowing wrong in a way only Adrian could see. It was not poison. It was worse for that particular night. A trusted old remedy stacked badly on top of stress and rage, hammering an old man's heart. Luke insisted the old man only needed elevation and calm, not aggressive intervention. Adrian ignored him completely, cleared Robert's airway, and began compressions with steady, practiced hands. Juliet grabbed his sleeve, not gently, but like a woman pulling someone back from an edge with both hands. On the third compression, Robert coughed, and air tore back into his lungs. That single breath did more damage to Luke's reputation than every speech he had made all night. Robert opened his eyes and looked at Adrian first, not at the man who claimed to be a doctor. His next words landed like a verdict: the apology expired. Luke flinched as if the sentence had physical teeth, because in that room, it did. Robert's own father, Leonard, arrived moments later, took one look at the scene, and somehow still called Luke's pride a form of backbone. Juliet had reached her limit with her grandfather's excuses and walked out of the hotel to breathe. Luke disappeared through a service hallway soon after, and did not stay gone the way a smarter man would have. Runaways in a city like New Harbor do not hide in quiet places. They hide under neon, where witnesses are cheap and lighting is flattering. Security cameras traced Luke crossing the alleys and slipping into a place called Blue Harbor Lounge. Through his staff door, he had already found new shelter, this time wearing a borrowed staff badge instead of a hero's cape. Adrian learned something else on the drive over. Juliet Moreland had argued with her grandfather and stormed out of her family's car, alone and angry. Robert called personally, asking Adrian to answer if his daughter reached out, because she would never call her own father in that state. Two guards flanked the lounge entrance. One glanced at Adrian's security chief and quietly decided his own safety was not worth the argument. Inside, the music was loud enough to hide threats and bright enough to make bad decisions look glamorous. Officer Dana Royston was there too, off duty, one untouched glass of water in front of her, because Destiny apparently loved throwing witnesses into every room Adrian entered. A staff monitor briefly visible through an open door showed Luke Farrow standing in a black vest, wearing a badge that read Security Captain. He had lost a $500 million business deal and reinvented himself as mall security with cheekbones. On the main floor, alone near the VIP rail, sat Juliet Moreland, hair down, jacket gone, a half-finished drink pushed away from her hand. A heavy-set local enforcer named Duke Reading loomed close to her chair, offering a second glass she had not asked for. Juliet refused clearly, over the music. Duke laughed it off, the exact laugh of a man who mistook refusal for negotiation. Something in that second glass caught Adrian's attention immediately. A faint warning shimmer only he could perceive. It was not strong enough to kill. It was strong enough to make a sharp woman soft, confused, and very easy to ruin on camera. Adrian crossed the floor and closed his hand around Duke's wrist before it ever touched Juliet's glass. Duke demanded to know if Adrian understood who he worked for. Adrian admitted he was trying very hard not to care. He lifted the drugged glass to Duke's own face and offered it back to him. If it is safe, drink it yourself. Duke refused, and that refusal was the simplest lie detector New Harbor had ever produced. On the office monitor above the bar, Luke watched the entire scene unfold and did not come out to help. That hesitation cost him everything he had left. A hero seen freezing on camera is worse than a hero who never showed up at all. The lounge owner rushed out, apologizing, trying to smooth over what his own hired muscle had just attempted. Duke's employer, a local gang leader named Vito, was suddenly a name everyone in the room recognized without needing an introduction. Juliet tried to stand on her own, swayed, and Adrienne caught her before she reached the floor. He asked one plain question. "Can you walk?" She said yes, and immediately proved herself wrong. His security chief moved to her other side without touching her until Adrienne gave a small nod. Protection without ownership mattered, even for the richest woman in the room. Duke, humiliated in front of a growing crowd of phones, dragged his own wounded pride outside and armed it with something worse. The front doors opened onto a dozen men holding steel pipes, blocking the curb like a small, poorly funded army. Duke demanded an apology, and the woman handed back to his men, as if either belonged to him. Adrienne stepped forward instead, and what followed was short, brutal, and almost embarrassingly one-sided. He moved through the first attacker's swing, redirected the second man into a parked car, and left a third groaning against the pavement. His two loyal guards took hits meant for Juliet and never once broke formation or ran. That loyalty earned an immediate, very public reward, a promise bonus, announced loud enough for every phone in the crowd to record. Word like that travels faster than any threat, because loyal men who bleed and grow richer become legends among men who bleed and are forgotten. Duke ended up on one knee, humiliated in front of dozens of recording strangers, warned that his boss Vito now had 3 days to answer for tonight properly. Through it all, two more familiar faces appeared from a side exit. An old acquaintance named Tinsley and the nurse, Amelia Hartwell. Both women helped shield Juliet from the chaos and the cameras without being asked twice. Amelia watched the staff monitor, where Luke still stood, frozen behind glass, and finally admitted out loud that he was doing nothing at all. That small sentence did more damage to Luke's reputation than any punch thrown that night. Juliet, exhausted and unsteady, made one clear request before losing focus completely. "Call my father, not my grandfather." Adrienne honored that request immediately, choosing to protect a barely conscious woman with distance, witnesses, and cold water rather than temptation. He drove her to his own private lake house instead of her family estate, specifically to keep reporters and Leonard Moreland's people away from her. His secretary, a sharp, quietly possessive woman named Eloise Harley, was already waiting at the gate, having personally chased off a paparazzi van before Adrienne even arrived. Juliet noticed that protection had started before she was even awake enough to defend herself, and that observation complicated more than it comforted. Adrienne did not enter her room. He stayed in the hallway with his staff, refusing every opportunity a lesser man would have taken. When Juliet woke enough to ask if anything had happened, his answer was blunt and almost funny. "You called my hallway ugly and insulted its howl, nothing else." That honesty, more than any speech, was what finally made her lower her guard completely. Not long after, a black wax-sealed envelope arrived at the gate. No name, no signature. Only an invitation to a public apology staged by the very gang Duke worked for. Adrienne recognized the pattern immediately. Vito wanted a stage of his own this time, not a private one. On the phone, Robert Moreland confirmed his daughter was choosing to stay under Blackwell protection publicly, even while his own father argued in the background that this only created a new debt. Then a second complication arrived by text message, a woman named Peyton Glass, claiming useful information and offering herself as an ally. A single selfie followed the message: expensive taste, calculating eyes, greed-wearing lip gloss. Adrienne replied with one word: tomorrow. His secretary asked coldly if she should mark it as coffee on his calendar. He corrected her instead: mark it as trouble. Coffee is just the cup. By the following afternoon, a broke, unpublished writer with an unexplained $20,000 in his account had already made the Destiny ledger hesitate for the first time. Peyton Glass chose a coffee shop with wide street-facing windows, the kind of seat a woman picks when she wants to be seen, not hidden. Adrienne arrived with only his security chief for company, expecting a transaction, and receiving one almost immediately. Peyton admitted plainly that she knew everyone who had recorded the chaos at Blue Harbor Lounge, and which clips could still be steered. When Adrienne asked what she actually wanted, she answered with refreshing honesty: money, comfort, access, a table where people stop treating me like background noise. He appreciated the lack of a love speech far more than he expected to. Midway through their meeting, a thin man in a wrinkled jacket burst through the coffee shop door, pointing directly at Peyton. His name was Quentin Rush, an unpublished writer she had quietly discarded by text message that same morning. Peyton's dismissal of him in public was cold enough to silence half the coffee shop, ending with an unapologetic $20,000 breakup payment sent live in front of witnesses. Quentin's humiliation curdled into something colder than anger. Adrian recognized the shift immediately because he had seen it before. In men the story had chosen. Then Quentin said something that should not have existed in that world at all. Rich villains always mistake the first payment for the last chapter. Adrian's hand went still around his coffee cup. He had read that exact sentence once before. In another life, on a cracked phone screen at 3 in the morning. It did not belong in Quentin Rush's mouth, in this city, in this story. And yet there it was. The destiny ledger snapped open harder than it ever had before. A second protagonist, unresolved, rising in luck with every second that passed. To chosen men were not simply a twist. They were, Adrian decided grimly, closer to a tax audit sent straight from hell. Quentin wrote one final sentence on the back of a receipt and slid it across the table. Before leaving, the villain sat behind glass and believed the crowd belonged to him. He photographed it before anyone could stop him and walked out without looking back, already rewriting the story in his own head. A black, wax-sealed card slipped from his notebook on the way out. The same style Vito's people had delivered days earlier. Adrian realized with a familiar dull dread that the broke writer already had a black card of his own. An old debt or a new alliance nobody had explained yet. 3 separate threats were now converging on a single night. Vito wanted his public stage. Luke wanted a comeback. Quentin Rush wanted a story with Adrian cast permanently as the monster. The harbor room, when it finally opened, arrived wearing chandeliers, champagne, wealthy donors, and one very ugly sentence already spreading across half the phones in attendance. An anonymous post claimed Adrian had staged violence, kidnapped an injured woman, and paid witnesses with blood money. No proof, no signature. Just enough poison to make a room full of bored rich people sip their drinks a little slower. Quentin stood near the donor wall in cheap clothes, filming everything, clearly pleased with how poor he still looked in a room full of diamonds. Across the room, Luke Farrow stood beside Vito himself, clean-suited, calm-faced, wearing a doctor's posture like it still meant something after everything he had lost. Leonard Moreland sat in a high back chair, cane across his knees, pride curdled into stubborn old man posture. He ordered Juliet to stand beside Luke for the sake of appearances. She refused instantly. In front of everyone. My elbow is not an apology prop. Vito approached first, all smiles, offering Duke's forced apology like a peace offering wrapped around a hidden blade. Duke, bruised and obedient in a way that looked rehearsed rather than sincere, apologized publicly, but only after being pushed to name the guards he had actually attacked. Vito lifted a champagne glass and proposed a toast to peace between families, forgetting, or perhaps hoping no one remembered, that hosts traditionally drink first. Adrian's danger sense flared bright red the moment Duke's hand drifted toward the tray, a hidden ring glinting on his finger. Leonard reached for a glass first. Adrian knocked it from his hand a half-second too late, and the old man's lips had already brushed the rim. At the same instant, he caught Robert Moreland's wrist before a second poisoned glass ever reached his mouth. Champagne shattered across the marble floor as chaos erupted through the donor crowd, phones lifting instantly to capture the scandal. Luke shoved forward immediately, insisting the collapsing elder simply needed his special tonic, the very same remedy that had nearly killed Robert days earlier. Adrian refused to let him near the bottle, forcing Leonard's head sideways and clearing his airway by hand instead, cold, efficient, and unglamorous. Leonard coughed hard and spat champagne into a napkin, alive, humiliated, and furious in equal measure. Officer Dana Royston, present off duty once again, quietly confirmed out loud that she had heard Luke call for the same dangerous tonic. Before anyone even explained what had happened, Adrian caught Duke's ring hand and slammed it flat against the linen tablecloth, exposing a thin hidden needle mechanism built directly into the jewelry. A nearby donor screamed. Duke's composure collapsed completely under the weight of his own evidence. Cornered, Duke confessed everything on the spot, admitting Vito himself had handed him the poison ring earlier that evening. Vito tried to disown him instantly, calling his own loyal enforcer a rogue idiot in front of the entire donor crowd. Duke, bleeding and betrayed by the very boss he had knelt for, spat blood onto the tablecloth and told the truth without hesitation. You handed me the ring. One by one, Vito's own men began quietly retreating toward the exits, abandoning their leader the moment loyalty stopped paying better than survival. Before the chaos could settle, the rear doors of the harbor room opened, and Tanner Blackwell limped inside, brace on his leg, prepared statement shaking in his hand. Someone else had clearly written those pages for him. Thick paper, large font. Carefully engineered sympathy dressed up as literacy. Juliet moved to stop him immediately. Adrienne raised one hand instead and told her simply, "Not yet." Tanner reached the donor microphone and introduced himself publicly as Adrienne Blackwell's only son. He accused his own father of assault, of freezing his accounts, of threatening staff into silence, and of using private security to control an entire family. Then he defended Luke Farrow directly, calling him a protector unfairly punished for standing up to Blackwell money. He promised, if he ever inherited the company, to restore Luke's reputation and personally review every business deal his father had ever made. He even demanded Blackwell Capital publicly fund Luke's so-called medical work, as a form of correction. My son, Adrienne realized in that moment, had not simply betrayed him. He had tried to spend an entire company on the very men who had used him as a weapon. Adrienne walked calmly to the microphone himself, and the crowd parted before him without needing to be asked. He stated the family rule plainly for every donor in that room to hear. A Blackwell heir who sells the family name loses the name attached to it. His secretary moved one finger across her tablet, and every Blackwell executive's phone in the building buzzed at the exact same instant. 3 lines appeared on the giant display behind the stage. Trust terminated. Capital access revoked. Authority removed. Tanner's own phone flashed one clean denial in his hand. Blackwell Capital badge inactive. His call for help failed before the first ring even completed. Money, for the first time in his entire life, had simply stopped answering him. Tanner accused his father of turning him into a target, because he had made him desperate in the first place. Adrienne agreed without flinching. "I made you desperate," he said. "They made you useful. You made yourself disposable." His security chief escorted Tanner from the stage, not gently, but professionally, and no donor in that room reached out to stop it or offer him comfort. Luke Farrow finally moved, lunging at Adrienne himself, calling him a monster for cutting off his own son in public. Adrienne caught his wrist mid-strike, the exact same motion he had once used to stop Tanner in a hospital room, only cleaner and stronger now. Luke twisted free and aimed a strike at Adrienne's throat instead. It never landed. Adrienne turned his wrist, drove a shoulder into his ribs, and put him flat on the stage floor hard enough to kill the microphone feedback. Once she rested beside Luke's hand, not on it, a small, deliberate mercy, stayed down for once. Luke listened. In Adrienne's vision, the ledger delivered its heaviest verdict of the entire night. Primary protagonist root collapsed. Support chain broken. Amelia did not move toward Luke on the floor. Officer Dana did not reach for her badge to protect him either. He had lost the women who could have vouched for him, the officer who could have shielded him, and the old doctor who could have excused him, all in a single public evening. Vito ordered his remaining men to move in. Not one of them obeyed. Abandonment, when it finally arrives, is always quieter than anyone expects. Juliet Moreland stepped onto the stage before her grandfather could speak another word. On Luke's behalf, her voice carried across the room without needing a microphone at all. Moreland Group remains with Adrienne Blackwell. She added one final, unmistakable line, meant for every donor and every camera in the room. There is no engagement route through me. No old favor, no family pressure, no second discussion. Her father stood behind her, confirming it publicly. My daughter speaks for Moreland tonight. Leonard Moreland, gripping his cane, finally looked away from Luke entirely. For a man addicted to old favors, that silence was the most expensive apology he had ever offered. In Adrienne's vision, the ledger delivered its final message of the night. Shield son fate broken. Original death route severed. Major luck recovery confirmed. No overpass, no son selling his father's name while being protected out of blind loyalty. That particular death sentence was finally gone for good. A donor near the aisle whispered to another that Adrienne had truly cut off his own son in public. The second donor answered simply, after the son sold him. Public opinion in that room did not turn into affection. It turned into something colder and more useful. Calculation. His security chief returned from escorting Tanner out, reporting that the boy was safely in a car with 2 guards, on a medical route only, nothing more. Adrienne nodded once. Good, was all he said. Luke groaned on the stage floor. Vito stared at the exits his own men had chosen over him. Leonard looked, for the very first time, genuinely old. Robert looked relieved. Juliet looked furious. Though for once, none of that fury pointed at Adrienne himself. Eloise stood one careful step behind Juliet, already planning the next 5 problems this single night had created. Quentin Rush stepped backward into the crowd, thumb already tapping out a fresh headline. Adrienne Blackwell cuts off his injured son in public. Adrienne chose not to chase him. Silencing a poor writer minutes after a public family execution would only hand him exactly the story he wanted to tell. In his vision, one final flicker appeared, weaker than the rest, but unmistakably nastier. Quentin Rushluck rising. Public story route active. The universe, he decided, would never let him leave a single night with a completely clean plate. It simply waited until after the meal was finished. Rewind a little, because before the harbor room, there was Blackwell Tower. And Blackwell Tower had its own storm waiting. By the time Adrienne reached the top floor, Tanner's earlier hospital tantrum clip had already learned how to climb corporate ladders on its own. It reached 3 assistants within minutes. Then one executive forwarded it with a note asking if the Moreland deal should be delayed until, in his words, family optics stabilized. Family optics, Adrienne thought, was simply rich people language for fear-wearing expensive cufflinks. His secretary, Eloise Harley, met him at the elevator, tablet pressed against her chest, already briefing him before the doors fully opened. The company's finance vice president had called an emergency strategy meeting and used the word exposure twice in one sentence. Exposure, Adrienne told her, is what cowards call a mirror. Inside the glass conference room, 5 executives sat around a paused image of Tanner's wet, tearful face on the wall screen, cut carefully just before the part where he threatened hospital staff. The finance vice president stood the moment Adrienne entered, insisting nobody questioned his authority. Then sit down, Adrienne said, before you start accidentally proving otherwise. He sat immediately, first blood, cheap but effective. The executive argued that the $500 million Moreland folder was too valuable to risk, while a damaging clip circulated publicly, and suggested a temporary delay to protect shareholder confidence. Adrienne looked at the paused screen, then back at the man. If a 30-second clip of my spoiled son crying makes you delay $500 million, you are not protecting confidence. You are advertising that you never had any. Color drained from the executive's face. The room went quiet enough that the building's own air conditioning sounded expensive. He reached toward the Moreland folder anyway, not quite a grab, something more careful and cowardly. A custody gesture performed for an audience that wanted someone else to be brave first. Before his fingers touched the seal, Eloise's tablet chirped. An assistant outside the glass had already forwarded a new message from Tanner, offering $50,000 to whoever leaked the clip to media first. The finance vice president saw it and somehow found fresh courage inside his own boss's stupidity. This is exactly why we should delay, he insisted. Adrienne's palm landed flat on the folder. The room heard the paper stop moving. No, he said. This is why we stop confusing a leak with leverage. The executive froze mid-reach. He had grabbed for a file and touched a trap instead. Adrienne addressed the entire room plainly. Adrienne Blackwell disciplines his own house before touching anyone else's. That line hit harder than any formal statement could have, because it named a rule instead of offering an excuse. Nobody in that room particularly loved morality. They loved predictability. A vicious boss could be managed. An indulgent boss with a reckless air was simply a fire wearing a silk suit. He picked up his phone and nodded to Eloise, who connected the family trust office directly onto the conference speaker. Freeze Tanner Blackwell's discretionary trust access, he ordered. Personal spending, entertainment accounts, emergency overrides, signature privileges. The trust officer hesitated, asking to confirm all discretionary access. All of it. Adrienne confirmed. Medical care stays funded. Ego care does not. The confirmation came back cleanly. Tanner Blackwell's discretionary access is now frozen pending your release. Before the echo of that confirmation even died, Tanner's own call blasted through the conference room speaker, because his assistant had not muted the line fast enough. Dad, what did you do to my accounts? Tanner shouted, loud enough for all 5 executives to hear clearly. I tried to order a private transfer and the card just died. The room listened, silent, as an heir discovered publicly that his leash was real. Adrienne leaned toward the speaker calmly. Tanner, your voice is currently in a conference room. Choose your next sentence like it cost money. Silence followed. Then Tanner whispered that he had been put on speaker, put on display. Adrienne answered simply, I upgraded the medium. He ended the call there, leaving the finance vice president staring at a blank screen, visibly reconsidering every opinion he had walked in with. Adrienne asked him plainly if he was still worried about family discipline. No, Mr. Blackwell, came the careful answer. He kept the executive assigned to the Moreland file anyway. Reasoning allowed that fear tends to make better staff when a man has to sign his own work. Eloise slid the untouched Moreland folder back to the center of the table, correcting the room quietly. Mr. Blackwell did not ask for storage. The finance executive heard something worse in that correction than any scolding. The realization that his own secretary trusted her employer's order more completely than she trusted his title. That kind of small, precise office humiliation travels through a company faster than any rumor ever could. Word soon reached Eloise that Robert Moreland himself had called twice, requesting dinner that same evening at the Crown Meridian Hotel, specifically to discuss Luke Farrow, an old family favor, and Robert's own father Leonard. The Moreland name alone changed the pressure in the room. $500 million tended to do that. Moments later, a private elevator notification confirmed to visitors already arriving on the executive floor Robert Moreland and his daughter Juliet. So dinner, Adrienne realized, had already sent its own preview ahead of schedule. Robert entered with the posture of a man who had signed far too many deals to ever beg badly. Juliet walked beside him in a sharp charcoal suit, colder than the glass conference walls and considerably more useful. She did not look at the paused clip first. She looked instead at the executives who had clearly been watching it, and delivered one clean insult that ended the meeting entirely. "If this is how Blackwell Capital prepares for a simple dinner," she said, "I can wait downstairs while the room finishes enjoying someone else's family pain." The finance vice president died a small, quiet, professional death right there at the table. That single sentence set the tone for everything that followed, all the way to Crown Meridian, all the way to the Blue Harbor Lounge, all the way to the harbor room itself. Looking back on that entire single day later, Adrienne understood exactly why the Destiny Ledger had rewarded him so consistently. Every choice the story expected from a villain, he had simply refused to make. He had refused to shield a son who used cruelty as a personality. He had refused to fight the chosen protagonist directly, letting handcuffs and public embarrassment do work that violence never could have accomplished cleanly. He had refused to accept comfortable lies from powerful old men clinging to favors they no longer deserved to spend. He had refused temptation with an unconscious, vulnerable woman inside his own private home, choosing distance and witnesses instead of the easy, dirty shortcut a lesser man might have taken. Each refusal had cost him something small, a little patience, a little comfort, a little of the easy cruelty the old Adrienne Blackwell had relied on for decades. And each refusal had paid him back tenfold in luck and loyalty, and in a story that no longer seemed to know exactly where to send him next. The security chief who once worked for a man he privately despised now stood beside someone he had actually chosen to trust. The secretary who once managed a household of quiet fear now guarded a household built on something closer to respect. The nurse who once flinched at the mere mention of the Blackwell name now stood taller every single time that name entered a room. Even the officer who had every professional reason to distrust a billionaire now watched him with something closer to reluctant, careful curiosity instead of pure suspicion. None of that made Adrienne Blackwell a good man, exactly. And he never once pretended otherwise to himself. He was still cold. He was still calculating. He still weighed every single person around him by the value they brought and the risk they carried. But he had stopped being the villain the story had written him to be. One small, deliberate refusal at a time. And that, in the end, mattered infinitely more than being liked ever could have. There were smaller currents running underneath all of this, quieter than the poison rings and the frozen trust accounts, but no less important to how the story shifted. Amelia Hartwell, the nurse who started this entire chain of events, never once became a damsel waiting for rescue. Every single time someone tried to speak for her, whether it was Luke, Tanner, or even her own grandfather, she corrected them herself, in her own voice. That habit, small as it seemed, kept earning quiet notice from the fate ledger itself, flashing important character impression shifts again and again. By the night of the harbor room, she was no longer the frightened nurse cornered in a hospital ward. She was a witness who had learned exactly what her own silence used to cost her. Officer Dana Royston followed a similar path, though she would have hated the comparison out loud. She never once fully trusted Adrienne Blackwell, and she made sure everyone around her knew it. But suspicion, applied evenly and honestly, turned out to be far more valuable to him than blind loyalty ever could have been. She held room steady without solving his problems for him, which was, in its own way, exactly the kind of ally a man rebuilding his own story actually needed. Then there was Eloise Harley, sharp, disciplined, and quietly possessive in ways she never once said out loud. She blocked paparazzi vans before anyone asked her to. She corrected executives without raising her voice. She noticed every glance Juliet Moreland sent toward her employer, and filed each one away behind a perfectly calm expression. That kind of quiet, competent loyalty was worth more to Adrienne than any declaration of affection could have been. And he knew better than to complicate it carelessly. Juliet Moreland herself never asked to be rescued, and resented every moment it looked like she needed to be. Every time Adrienne protected her, She made sure the room understood it was her own choice being honored, not her agency being replaced. That distinction, small as it sounded, was exactly what kept her story from collapsing into the kind of soft, forgettable heroine route the old narrative clearly wanted to hand her. By the time she stood on the harbor room stage and declared her family's loyalty publicly, she was not choosing Adrien out of romance. She was choosing him because he was the only person in that entire room who had never once asked her to be smaller than she actually was. Robert Moreland's own arc mattered too, quieter than his daughter's but just as real. A man who nearly died twice in 1 week learned, the hard way, exactly which people in his life were performing loyalty and which people were simply present when it counted. His own father, Leonard, never fully recovered his credibility after that. An old man who mistakes stubborn pride for wisdom eventually runs out of rooms willing to indulge him. Even Hugo Marx, the quiet, competent security chief, changed in his own understated way. He stopped asking why orders were given and started trusting that the man giving them had already thought 3 steps further ahead than anyone else in the room. That kind of trust cannot be purchased with a salary. It has to be earned one dangerous night at a time, and Adrien had earned it the hard way, blood, bruises, and all. On the walk from the private car into the harbor room itself, every one of these threads converged at once, whether Adrien wanted them to or not. Donors near the entrance were already whispering about the anonymous post, accusing him of staged violence and blood money. A few lowered their phones the moment they recognized him. A few raised them higher instead, hoping for exactly the kind of scandal the internet loved to feed on. Adrien walked through all of it without slowing his pace, because slowing down in front of an accusation is its own kind of confession. Hugo stayed 2 steps behind him, scanning exits out of habit rather than fear. Eloise trailed slightly further back, tablet ready, already anticipating 3 separate crises before they happened. Somewhere in that crowd, Quentin Rush was already filming, hunting for the exact angle that would make the story write itself in his favor. Somewhere else, Peyton Glass watched from a distance, calculating whether tonight's chaos would raise or lower her own market value. None of them fully understood yet that the ledger governing all of this had already started shifting decisively away from every villain route the story had originally written for Adrien Blackwell. Even the smallest details from earlier in the week kept paying quiet dividends inside that room. The archived video of Tanner threatening hospital staff, preserved instead of deleted, became the exact proof that discredited his prepared statement later that same night. The photograph of Amelia's bruised wrist, taken calmly instead of dismissed, became the reason nobody in that room could pretend the original clinic incident was ever her fault. The frozen emergency card, the frozen trust account, the archived call log demanding hired violence. Each one became a brick in a wall the old villain never would have bothered building. That was, in the end, the real difference between the man who died under an overpass and the man who walked into that harbor room with donors whispering his name. The old Adrien Blackwell reacted. He punished first and explained never, protecting the people who least deserved protecting simply because they shared his blood or his bed. The new Adrien Blackwell built evidence quietly, months before he ever needed to use it, and let other people's own cruelty do the damage for him. That patience, more than any punch thrown that night, was the real weapon the Destiny Ledger had been rewarding all along. Back inside the harbor room, once the chaos of Duke's confession and Tanner's collapse finally settled, the crowd of donors slowly returned to something resembling normal conversation. Nobody clapped, nobody cheered. The room simply recalculated, quietly, table by table, exactly where power now stood. Robert Moreland, still pale from his earlier collapse, insisted on staying upright through the rest of the evening, rather than being carried out on a stretcher a second time. Juliet stayed close beside her father, refusing every offer of assistance from anyone but the staff she personally trusted. Leonard Moreland sat alone in his high-backed chair for a long stretch of the evening, cane resting untouched across his knees, saying nothing to anyone. For a man who had spent his entire life defending backbone as a virtue, silence was the closest thing to an apology he had ever managed to offer. Officer Dana Royston stayed near the wall long after the ambulance took Luke away for observation, filling out a report nobody had technically asked her to write yet. Amelia Hartwell stood beside her grandfather, who looked, for the first time all week, genuinely tired rather than proud. Peyton Glass slipped out early, already texting someone new, already calculating her next move before the room had even finished processing the last one. Quentin Rush lingered near the exit longest of anyone, phone still in hand, clearly already composing the headline he intended to publish before sunrise. Hugo Marx checked in with the guards stationed outside, confirming Tanner's car had reached the hospital safely under medical supervision only. Eloise Hartley remained exactly where she always remained, one careful step behind, tablet glowing, already listing tomorrow's 5 most urgent problems in order of severity. And Adrian Blackwell stood near the center of a room that no longer knew where to aim its fear, its gratitude, or its cameras. He had not asked to be liked. He had never expected to be forgiven for the things that old Adrian had done. Before he ever arrived in this body, he had simply refused, over and over again, to play the part destiny had written for him, and the room around him had reshaped itself in response. In the days that followed the harbor room, New Harbor slowly began sorting fact from rumor, the way cities always do once the cameras stop rolling. Duke Redding's confession, recorded by a dozen different phones from a dozen different angles, made any denial from Vito's side almost pointless. Local police, no longer able to ignore an attempted poisoning witnessed by half the city's donor class, opened a formal investigation into Vito's entire operation. Most of his remaining men scattered within days, choosing quiet survival over loyalty to a boss who had just been caught arming an assassination in public. Vito himself remained free for the moment, but free in the way a man is free while standing on ice that has already started cracking beneath him. Adrian did not chase him personally. He let official channels do the slow, grinding work instead, patient enough now to let consequences arrive on their own schedule. Luke Farrow spent that first night under medical observation, not for any serious injury, but because a man who has just lost every ally in a single evening needs somewhere quiet to fall apart privately. Dr. Samuel Hartwell visited him once, briefly, and left without saying much of anything. Whatever conversation happened between them stayed behind closed doors. Amelia did not visit at all. She spent that week instead training a new nurse at Hartwell Clinic, steady, focused, and visibly lighter than she had been in months. When reporters eventually tracked her down for a comment about the man once hailed as her hero, her answer was short and unbothered. He was brave when it was easy. That is not the same thing as being brave. Tanner Blackwell remained in Greystone Medical Center under strict medical care only, exactly as his father had ordered. His trust access stayed frozen. His public statement, thoroughly discredited by the archived footage of his own threats, quietly disappeared from most news cycles within a week. He did not apologize. Adrian had not expected him to. Some lessons take longer than one humiliating night to actually land. What mattered more was that Tanner no longer had the authority to hurt anyone else, while he figured that lesson out on his own time. Quentin Rush published his article exactly as promised, framing Adrian as a cold, calculating man who had publicly disowned his own injured son without mercy. The article gained attention, but not the kind Quentin had hoped for. Too many donors in that room had personally witnessed Tanner's threats, his trust fund bribery attempt, and his betrayal of the family that raised him. Public sympathy, once again, refused to follow the script a broke writer with rising luck had tried to force onto it. Peyton Glass resurfaced twice more over the following weeks, each time offering information in exchange for access. Each time reminded plainly that her usefulness came with a warranty, not a guarantee. She never fully became an ally. She never fully became an enemy either. She remained exactly what she had always been, a dangerous, honest kind of greed that required careful handling rather than trust. Robert Moreland recovered fully within days, though his doctors quietly recommended he retire the old family tonic his own father had insisted on for years. Leonard Moreland grew noticeably quieter after that night, no longer defending every young man who claimed backbone as an excuse for cruelty. The $500 million deal between Blackwell Capital and Moreland Group proceeded exactly as scheduled, with Juliet personally overseeing every clause herself. Juliet Moreland and Adrian Blackwell did not become a storybook romance overnight, and neither of them particularly wanted that kind of easy, convenient ending anyway. What grew between them instead was something closer to mutual respect forged under pressure, the kind that survives far longer than any borrowed fairy tale ever could. Eloise Hartley remained exactly as essential as she had always been, quietly managing an empire that no longer required constant damage control the way it once had. Hugo Marks never asked for credit and never received a formal one either, but every guard on that security team knew precisely whose loyalty had actually kept the family standing upright. The Destiny ledger itself grew quieter in the weeks that followed, no longer flashing constant warnings and rewards with every single conversation. Occasionally it still stirred a faint flicker here, a small note there, whenever some new complication tried to force its way back into the story. Adrian understood by then that the ledger had never been a gift exactly. It had been a mirror, showing him precisely how close he had once come to repeating a dead man's worst mistakes. Every time he refused those mistakes, the mirror rewarded him. Every time he almost slipped, it warned him just in time. He no longer needed constant warnings by the end of that first difficult month. He had finally learned the hard way exactly what kind of man he intended to remain. Not a hero, certainly. Heroes, in his experience, tended to end up exactly like Luke Farrow, standing frozen behind glass while the moment that mattered most slipped away from them. Not the old villain either, the one who died crushed under concrete and rain, protecting a son who would have sold his name the very first chance he got. Something else entirely. Something colder, more careful, and infinitely harder to write a convenient ending for. Looking back, Adrien could trace almost every single victory of that first brutal week to one repeated pattern, small and unglamorous but devastatingly effective. He never once reached for the dramatic move the story clearly wanted from him. He did not send private soldiers after Luke Farrow. He let handcuffs and public embarrassment do that work instead, far more thoroughly than violence ever could have. He did not silence Quentin Rush the moment the man became inconvenient. He let the writer's own arrogance discredit him in front of an entire room of witnesses. He did not poison Vito's reputation with rumors. He simply exposed the poison Vito's own men had already brought into the room themselves. Every single time Destiny tried to hand him the easy, cinematic villain move, he chose the slower, quieter, more deliberate option instead. And every single time, the ledger behind his eyes confirmed what he already suspected. Patience. Applied correctly, beat cruelty in almost every single scenario the story tried to test him with. That was the real secret nobody in New Harbor fully understood yet. Not Juliet, not Robert, not even Hugo, who trusted him without needing an explanation. Adrien Blackwell had not survived that first impossible week by being stronger than everyone around him. Though the internal force flowing through his hands certainly helped, he had survived by refusing, again and again, patiently and deliberately, to become the man the story had already written him to be. Somewhere in that refusal, a broken family had started, slowly and imperfectly, to become something worth protecting rather than something worth escaping. Somewhere in that refusal, a frightened nurse had learned to speak clearly in rooms that once terrified her into silence. Somewhere in that refusal, a suspicious officer had started extending something close to trust, one careful inch at a time. Somewhere in that refusal, a grieving billionaire family had finally stopped bleeding money and dignity in equal measure. None of it happened because Adrien Blackwell wanted to be a good man. He never once claimed that title for himself, and he would have laughed at anyone who tried to hand it to him. It happened because he wanted, more than anything else, to survive a story that had already killed him once. And surviving, he had discovered, required something far harder than simple strength. It required discipline, patience, and the constant, exhausting willingness to disappoint everyone who expected him to fail exactly as predicted. By the time the last of the harbor room's champagne stains had been cleaned from the marble floor, New Harbor understood one thing clearly, whether it wanted to or not. Adrien Blackwell was no longer the villain the old story had prepared for. He had rewritten his own role, one refusal at a time, in front of witnesses who could never fully unsee it. And somewhere beyond the edges of his vision, the Destiny ledger stayed quiet, watching, waiting to see exactly what kind of man would walk through whatever door opened next. There was one more quiet scene worth telling before this chapter of his life closed completely. A week after the harbor room, Adrien returned to Greystone Medical Center alone, without Hugo, without Eloise, without a single camera trailing behind him. Tanner sat upright in his hospital bed, brace still on his leg, phone still disconnected from anything resembling family money. He did not scream this time. He did not threaten anyone. He simply looked up when his father entered the room, wary in a way he had never been before that week. Adrien did not apologize for freezing his accounts. He did not soften the rule he had announced publicly in front of an entire room of donors. Instead, he asked one plain question: "You understand yet why I did it?" Tanner was quiet for a long moment before answering honestly for what might have been the first time in his adult life. "Because I would have used you the same way Luke used me." That answer did not fix everything between them. It did not erase months of entitlement or years of inherited cruelty in a single sentence. But it was, Adrien decided, a start, a small, honest, unglamorous start. Exactly the kind of foundation the old villain Rude had never once bothered to build. He told his son plainly that medical care would continue for as long as it was needed, and that authority would return only when it had actually been earned rather than assumed. Tanner nodded, slowly, and for once did not argue. It was not a warm scene. It was not the kind of tearful reconciliation the old story would have written for a father and son, standing at the edge of ruin. It was simply two men, one reborn into a role he never asked for, and one finally beginning to understand the weight of a name he had never once earned. Sitting quietly in a hospital room neither of them particularly wanted to be in. Outside that window, New Harbor kept moving the way cities always do, indifferent to the small, private reckonings happening inside any single room. Somewhere across the city, Juliet Moreland was closing a $500 million deal with a signature that carried far more weight than any old family favor ever had. Somewhere else, Officer Dana Royston was filing paperwork on a gang leader whose empire had started collapsing from the inside out. Somewhere else still, Amelia Hartwell was training a nervous new nurse how to speak clearly in a room full of people who expected her silence. And somewhere in Blackwell Tower, Eloise Hartley was already 3 steps ahead of tomorrow's problems, exactly as she always was. None of it felt like victory in the loud, cinematic sense the old story might have promised. It felt instead like the slow, unglamorous work of actually building something worth protecting, one difficult day at a time. Adrian Blackwell stood by his son's hospital window for a long moment before finally speaking again. "You get one more chance to prove you understand this," he said quietly. "Not because you are my son, because you asked the right question honestly for once." Tanner looked at him, and for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, there was no anger in the room at all. Just 2 men, quietly rebuilding something neither of them had ever known how to build correctly the first time. Luke Farrow eventually left New Harbor entirely, quietly, without another public speech or a final dramatic confrontation. Some said he moved to a smaller city, hoping to start over somewhere his name did not already mean cowardice behind glass. Adrienne never bothered chasing that rumor down. A protagonist who loses his entire support chain in a single evening rarely finds his way back to relevance twice. Vito Sons was formally indicted within the month, the poisoned ring alone providing more than enough evidence for a case that no longer needed Adrienne's involvement at all. Duke Reading testified against his former boss in exchange for a reduced sentence, proving once again that loyalty bought through fear rarely survives its first real test. Quentin Rush kept writing, though his articles grew steadily less popular once readers realized his sharpest lines always seemed to arrive one step ahead of events he supposedly had no way of predicting. Whatever strange thread connected him to Adrienne's own arrival in this world remained unresolved. A quiet loose end the ledger occasionally still flickered over. Adrienne chose not to chase that mystery immediately either. Some threads, he had learned, were worth watching patiently rather than confronting head-on. Peyton Glass eventually found a new source of income entirely unrelated to Blackwell business, proving that greed, when left unchecked but carefully managed, tends to wander toward wherever the next opportunity happens to be. New Harbor itself slowly stopped whispering about the harbor room scandal, the way every city eventually moves on from even its loudest headlines. What remained, quietly and permanently, was a simple, well-understood fact among everyone who mattered in that world. Adrian Blackwell no longer needed fear to hold his empire together. Respect, earned the hard way, held it together instead. Months later, when people in New Harbor told this story at dinner parties, they never agreed on what to call it. Some called it the night a billionaire disowned his own son in public, and left it at that, as if cruelty alone explained everything that happened. Others, the ones who had actually stood inside that harbor room, remembered it differently. They remembered a man who refused, over and over, to take the easy, violent, expected path, even when every single person around him assumed he would. They remembered a nurse who stopped shaking, an officer who stopped assuming the worst, a daughter who chose her own words over her family's old debts. They remembered a security chief who trusted an order before he understood it, and was proven right every single time. They remembered, most of all, that the loudest villain in the room that night was never the man everyone had been warned to fear. Adrian Blackwell had woken up inside a story that promised him one certain, inevitable ending. Crushed under concrete, betrayed by his own blind loyalty, forgotten within a single news cycle. He had spent one impossible week refusing that ending, one careful choice at a time, until the story itself no longer knew what to do with him. That, in the end, was the only kind of victory that ever actually mattered. Not the applause, not the headlines, not even the $500 million deal signed quietly in a glass conference room. The following week, just a man who had been handed a villain script and chosen, deliberately and repeatedly, to write something else instead. Every ledger he had ever seen in his old life kept records of numbers, profits and losses, cold and impersonal. This one, somehow, had kept a record of character instead, rewarding the version of himself that refused to repeat a dead man's worst mistakes. He never fully understood where that ledger came from, or why it had chosen him specifically. Out of every possible soul it could have stapled its warnings behind. He suspected, quietly, that it did not matter nearly as much as the choices it had forced him to make along the way. A system built entirely on rewarding cruelty would have simply handed him the villain's easy path, from the very first page. Instead, it had rewarded restraint, patience, loyalty earned rather than demanded, and mercy given carefully rather than wasted on people who would only spend it against him later. Whatever force had written New Harbor's original story, Adrian decided, had clearly expected him to fail exactly the way the previous version of himself had failed. It had not expected him to notice the difference between protecting someone and owning them. It had not expected him to reward loyalty in cash and public recognition, rather than quiet, unspoken obligation. It had certainly not expected him to let a chosen protagonist's own arrogance destroy him, one public room at a time, without ever throwing a single unnecessary punch. By refusing to be predictable, he had made himself impossible to ride around. That, in the end, was the quiet, unglamorous secret behind every single victory that impossible week had handed him. Not power, not money, though both certainly helped along the way. Simply the discipline to choose differently again and again, until the story itself ran out of convenient endings to offer him. And so, as New Harbor settled back into its usual rhythm of quiet corruption and expensive secrets, one truth remained clear to everyone who had watched closely enough. The villain the city had been warned to fear no longer existed. Something far more dangerous had taken his place instead, a man who refused to lose on schedule. Adrian Blackwell closed the hospital door behind him that evening and walked back out into a city that no longer whispered his name out of fear alone. Somewhere behind his eyes, faint and patient, the Destiny ledger kept its silent, permanent watch, waiting for whatever chapter came next. He did not know yet what that next chapter would demand of him. He only knew, with a certainty the old Adrian Blackwell never once possessed, exactly what kind of man he intended to remain inside it. Not a villain waiting to be punished, not a hero waiting for applause. Simply a man who had learned, one brutal week at a time, that refusing the easy, expected cruelty was its own kind of quiet, permanent power. And for the first time since waking up inside a stranger's tower, a stranger's black card, and a stranger's impossible son, that felt like more than enough. That single week had cost him a son's trust, a rival's freedom, and an old man's remaining pride, all at once. It had also earned him something none of that money could ever have purchased on its own. A household finally worth calling a family. And whatever the ledger behind his eyes had planned next, Adrian Blackwell intended to meet it exactly the same way he had met everything else. That impossible week. Wide awake, unafraid, and refusing, always, to play the part the story expected of him. That was the last thought he carried out of Greystone Medical Center that night. And it was, finally, the right one. So let us close this story the way it deserves to be closed, honestly, without another twist waiting behind the curtain. Adrian Blackwell did not become a saint after that week. He never once pretended he wanted to. He remained sharp, calculating, and dangerous to anyone foolish enough to mistake his patience for weakness. But he stopped being the man Destiny had written to lose everything under an overpass. And that difference changed the shape of every relationship around him. Tanner Blackwell spent the following months slowly earning back small, careful pieces of trust, one honest conversation at a time. He never regained the reckless authority he once wielded so carelessly. He gained something more valuable instead, the beginning of an actual character. Hugo Marks remained exactly what he had always been, quiet, competent, and utterly unwilling to let anyone reach his employer without earning the right first. He never asked for recognition. He received it anyway, in the form of a company that trusted him completely, and a boss who never once had to explain himself twice. Eloise Hartley continued running Blackwell Tower with the same quiet, ruthless efficiency that had saved it more than once during that impossible week. Whatever feelings she carried privately stayed exactly where she kept them, filed away neatly behind a calm professional expression nobody could fully read. Officer Dana Royston closed her investigation into Vito Sons within the month, her testimony carrying more weight than any wealthy family's influence ever could have. She remained suspicious of billionaires in general, and of Adrian Blackwell specifically, though her suspicion had softened, slowly, into something closer to grudging respect. Amelia Hartwell continued working at her grandfather's clinic, training new nurses in the exact skill that had once terrified her most, speaking clearly to powerful people without flinching. Dr. Samuel Hartwell grew quieter in his old age, no longer defending every confident young man who reminded him of the doctor he once wanted to become himself. Robert Moreland fully recovered from his collapse, and never again touched the old family tonic that nearly killed him twice in 1 week. Leonard Moreland spent his remaining years learning, slowly and reluctantly, that backbone, without wisdom, was simply another word for stubbornness. Juliet Moreland became one of the most respected names in New Harbor business, not because of any family favor, but because she had learned exactly how much her own voice was worth. She and Adrienne built something neither of them rushed to name: careful, deliberate, and built on mutual respect rather than convenient chemistry. Peyton Glass remained exactly as unpredictable as the day she first walked into that coffee shop. Useful, dangerous, and impossible to fully trust. Quentin Rush kept writing his strange, half-accurate stories about the man he still believed was destined to be New Harbor's villain. Adrienne read every single one of them, carefully, patiently, still watching for the day that strange, impossible knowledge finally revealed its true source. Vito Sun served his sentence quietly, his empire dismantled piece by piece by the very men who once knelt in front of him. Duke Reading testified, served his own reduced sentence, and never returned to New Harbor's underworld again. Luke Farrow's name faded slowly from public memory, the way most protagonists fade once the story stops handing them convenient rescues. Nobody in New Harbor spoke his name with admiration anymore. A few, quietly, remembered him only as a warning about the difference between courage and timing. New Harbor itself kept moving forward, indifferent as always to the private battles fought inside its glass towers and quiet hospital rooms. But something had genuinely shifted beneath the surface of that city, subtle enough that only the people who had lived through that impossible week could fully feel it. Fear no longer held the Blackwell name together. Something steadier, harder one, and far more difficult to shake, had taken its place. Adrienne Blackwell had woken up inside another man's ruined life, carrying another man's death sentence stapled behind his own eyes. He had been handed, without asking, the exact role every story like this one loves to write. The villain, the obstacle, the man history remembers only as the reason the real hero finally rose. He refused that role deliberately, patiently, one difficult choice at a time, across a single, impossible week that nearly broke him more than once. He refused to shield cruelty simply because it shared his blood. He refused to meet a chosen protagonist with violence, when patience would dismantle him more completely. He refused to spend an old man's mercy faster than it could be counted. And he refused to let temptation write his story for him, when nobody was watching closely enough to stop him. Every single refusal cost him something small: comfort, ease, the simple satisfaction of taking the shortcut destiny kept offering him. Every single refusal paid him back tenfold, and loyalty that could not be bought, respect that could not be faked, and a family finally worth the word. That, in the end, was the real story New Harbor never quite managed to tell correctly at its dinner parties. Not a billionaire who disowned his son out of cruelty. Not a monster who happened to win because he had more money than the men who tried to stop him. A man who woke up inside someone else's failure and chose, again and again, to become someone entirely different instead. He did not save New Harbor. He never once claimed that title, and would have laughed at anyone foolish enough to offer it to him. He simply refused to lose the way the story expected him to lose, and in doing so, quietly rewrote every single ending written for him in advance. Somewhere behind his eyes, the Destiny ledger remained patient, watching, recording, waiting for whatever came next. It no longer needed to warn him constantly. He had already learned the only lesson that mattered. A villain's script only works if the man reading it agrees to follow every single line, exactly as written. Adrienne Blackwell had stopped agreeing the moment he slapped his own son awake in a hospital ward, and he never once looked back at the man he used to be. That was not a happy ending in the way most stories promise one. It was something sturdier than that. It was a man, deliberately and permanently, choosing to become the exception instead of the warning. And in a city built on fear, favors, and convenient old money, that single choice turned out to be the most dangerous thing New Harbor had ever witnessed. Not violence, not wealth, not even the strange, unexplained knowledge stapled behind one man's eyes. Simply the discipline to refuse, calmly and completely, every single easy cruelty the world kept offering him for free. Adrienne Blackwell walked forward into whatever came next, wide awake, unafraid, and finally fully the author of his own story. Consider, for a moment, what actually separated this story from every other rise and fall the genre loves to repeat. It was never really about power, though power certainly changed hands more than once throughout that impossible week. It was about the small, unglamorous discipline of refusing convenience when convenience would have cost someone else everything. Every reader who has ever watched a rich man crush the people beneath him, without consequence, understands exactly why that refusal mattered so much here. Every reader who has ever watched a chosen hero coast on charm alone, without ever earning the loyalty he assumed was owed to him, understands exactly why Luke Farrow's fall felt so satisfying. The story never needed Adrienne Blackwell to be gentle. It needed him to be honest. Even when honesty cost him comfort, control, or the easy affection of people who only respected fear. That honesty is what separated him from the man who died under an overpass. And it is what separates real strength from the cheap, borrowed kind so many stories mistake for power. Tanner Blackwell's arc, in particular, deserves one more quiet moment of reflection before this story finally closes. He was never written as a villain himself, not really. He was written as a warning, the exact kind of consequence blind, unconditional protection eventually produces. Every parent who has ever shielded a child from the natural weight of their own choices will recognize something uncomfortable in his story. Every child who has ever mistaken inherited privilege for personal strength will recognize something even more uncomfortable in his fall. Adrien did not fix his son by punishing him harder than the world already had. He fixed him, slowly, by finally letting consequences reach him at all. That lesson mattered more than any slap, any frozen account, or any public humiliation delivered in front of a room full of donors. Juliette Moreland's arc offers its own quiet lesson, easy to miss beneath the glamour of $500 million business deals and poisoned champagne glasses. She never needed rescuing from danger nearly as much as she needed rescuing from being spoken for. Every single time someone tried to decide her feelings, her loyalty, or her family's future on her behalf, she corrected them plainly, in her own voice, regardless of the cost. That refusal to be a passive prize in someone else's story is exactly what made her worth writing about at all. Amelia Hartwell's arc, smaller in scale but no less important, reminds us that courage rarely looks like the dramatic, cinematic version stories usually sell us. Sometimes courage looks like a frightened nurse telling the truth in a hospital ward, full of powerful men who would have preferred her silence. Sometimes it looks like refusing to defend a man who once protected you, simply because protection stopped being the whole truth of who he was. Officer Dana Royston's arc reminds us that skepticism, applied fairly and consistently, is not the opposite of trust. It is often the foundation trust eventually gets built upon. She never once decided Adrien Blackwell was a good man. She simply refused to decide he was automatically the villain either, and let his actions answer that question for her over time. Hugo Marx and Eloise Hartley remind us of something quieter still, easy to overlook beneath the louder drama of poisoned rings and public confessions. Loyalty, real loyalty, is rarely loud. It shows up in small, consistent choices, checking exits, blocking paparazzi vans, trusting an order before fully understanding it. The kind of empire built on that quiet loyalty tends to survive far longer than the kind built on fear alone, no matter how impressive fear looks from the outside. And then there is Luke Farrow, the protagonist this entire story was originally supposed to belong to. His fall was never really about losing a fight. He lost far more dangerous battles than that. He lost the trust of a woman he once protected, the moment he froze behind glass instead of acting when it mattered. He lost the respect of an old doctor who had shaped his entire career, the moment he weaponized that same doctor's granddaughter in front of strangers. He lost the loyalty of allies who expected him to be exactly as brave in private as he claimed to be in public. Every story about a fallen hero eventually asks the same uncomfortable question: was he ever truly heroic? Or was he simply the only man standing in a room that had not yet learned to look elsewhere? Luke Farrow never answered that question well, and by the end, nobody in New Harbor particularly cared to ask it again. Vito's sons and Duke Reading offer their own smaller warning, easy to underestimate next to the bigger names in this story. Loyalty purchased through fear collapses the very first moment fear stops being the strongest force in the room. Duke knelt beautifully in public and confessed just as quickly the moment his own boss called him disposable in front of witnesses. That pattern repeats endlessly in every story about power built on intimidation, rather than genuine respect, and it repeated here exactly the same way. Quentin Rush and Peyton Glass remain, deliberately, the two loose threads in this entire story, unresolved on purpose. Not every mystery needs solving immediately. Not every strange coincidence needs a tidy explanation delivered before the credits roll. Sometimes the most honest ending a story can offer is an open door, quietly closed for now, waiting patiently for whatever comes next. Adrien Blackwell understood that better than anyone else in New Harbor. By the end of that impossible week, he had woken up inside a story with an ending already written for him, certain, inevitable, and utterly beneath the man he chose to become instead. He did not escape that story by being stronger than everyone around him, though strength certainly helped more than once. He escaped it by refusing, patiently and repeatedly, to play the part written for him, until the story itself lost track of where it was supposed to send him next. That is the quiet, unglamorous truth hiding beneath every dramatic slap, every frozen trust account, and every poisoned champagne glass in this entire story. Power never saved Adrien Blackwell. Money never saved him either. No matter how many black cards, security teams, or glass towers surrounded him, What actually saved him was something far simpler and far harder to fake: the discipline to choose differently over and over again, even when nobody was there to reward him for it immediately. If there is a single lesson worth carrying away from this entire story, it is not that money solves problems, though it certainly opens doors faster than most alternatives. It is not that violence applied correctly wins every confrontation, though Adrienne Blackwell's fist certainly settled more than one dangerous night. The real lesson sits quieter than either of those, easy to miss beneath the chandeliers and the poisoned champagne and the frozen trust accounts. Every person in this story who mattered by the end had, at some point, refused the easy version of themselves. Amelia refused silence, Dana refused blind suspicion, Juliet refused to be spoken for, Hugo refused to ask why before earning the right to know, Eloise refused to let jealousy override loyalty. Even Robert Moreland, half-conscious on a hotel carpet, refused to let an old family favor outweigh the truth sitting right in front of him. And Adrienne Blackwell, given every convenient excuse to become exactly the villain the story expected, refused that role more times than anyone else in New Harbor. That pattern, repeated across an entire cast of characters, is what actually turned this story from a simple revenge tale into something worth remembering longer than a single dramatic headline. Villains, in most stories like this one, are simply obstacles waiting to be removed so the real hero can shine. This story asked a slightly different question instead. What happens when the villain refuses to stay an obstacle and starts making better choices than the hero written to replace him? The answer, as New Harbor learned across one impossible week, is that the entire story stops working the way it was originally designed to. Luke Farrow was written to inherit everything Adrienne Blackwell built. Instead, he inherited a badge that meant nothing, a room full of witnesses who stopped believing him, and a silence louder than any confession. Tanner Blackwell was written to be the reason his father lost everything under an overpass. Instead, he became the reason his father finally learned what protecting someone actually means. Juliet Moreland was written, perhaps to be rescued, admired, and eventually claimed by whichever man proved himself worthy first. Instead, she rescued her own story from that expectation entirely, choosing her words, her family's alliance, and her own voice on her own terms. Every twist the story offered along the way, the poison rings, the black wax invitations, the frozen accounts, the public confessions, existed for one single purpose beneath the surface drama: to test, again and again, whether the man at the center of this story would finally break and become exactly what destiny expected of him. He never did. Not once. Not when it would have been easier. Not when it would have been faster. Not even when it would have felt, briefly, satisfying. That refusal, stacked patiently across dozens of smaller moments, is the entire story in miniature. A hospital slap that saved a nurse's dignity instead of destroying it. A frozen card that taught a spoiled heir the exact weight of consequence, for the first time in his life. A quiet walk into a clinic that let handcuffs to the work violence never could have accomplished as cleanly. A refusal to touch an unconscious woman inside his own private home, even when nobody watching would have known the difference. A public microphone that cut off the son's inheritance instead of defending his lives, in front of every donor who mattered in that city. A single shoe placed beside a fallen protagonist's hand instead of on top of it. Mercy delivered with a shadow instead of a boot. Every one of those moments mattered exactly as much as the louder, more dramatic confrontations surrounding them. Because that is how real change actually happens, not in one explosive, cinematic decision, but in dozens of smaller ones, repeated patiently until they finally add up to something unrecognizable. From where the story began, New Harbor never fully understood what it had witnessed that impossible week, not completely. Not the way the people who lived through it did, but somewhere in that city, quietly and permanently. The story of the villain who refused to lose kept being told, dinner party after dinner party. Each version slightly different. Each version missing something essential about the man at its center. The truth, simpler than any of those retellings ever managed to capture, was this: Adrienne Blackwell had been handed a death sentence and a stranger's ruined life and had chosen, deliberately and repeatedly, to build something worth living inside instead. Not because destiny rewarded him for it, though it certainly did, quietly, one ledger notification at a time, but because somewhere along the way, refusing cruelty had simply become who he was. Whether the story rewarded him for it or not. That is the ending the story earned patiently across every slap, every frozen account, every quiet refusal that built it one difficult choice at a time. Not a villain punished, not a hero crowned. Simply a man who woke up inside someone else's failure and chose, deliberately, to become someone else's proof that a different ending was always possible. New Harbor kept its lights on that night, indifferent as always to the quiet victory happening inside one hospital hallway. Adrian Blackwell walked out into that city one final time, carrying no more warnings behind his eyes than any other man carries into an uncertain future. Just the quiet, permanent knowledge that he had refused, completely and deliberately, to become the villain the story expected. And in the end, that refusal was the only inheritance worth leaving behind at all. So if you ever find yourself handed a role you never asked for, cast as the villain in someone else's convenient story, remember this. The script only works if you agree to follow it exactly as written. Refuse enough small cruelties patiently and consistently, and you will eventually find yourself standing somewhere the original story never planned for you to reach. That is not magic. That is not destiny rewarding good behavior with a floating scoreboard behind your eyes. It is simply the slow, unglamorous mathematics of character, added up one difficult choice at a time until the sum finally becomes undeniable. Adrian Blackwell did not become a hero by the end of this story, and he never once wanted that particular title for himself. He became something quieter, and in its own way, far more dangerous to the people who had once counted on his predictable cruelty. He became a man who could no longer be written around, no longer be counted on to fail exactly on schedule, no longer willing to spend other people's dignity to protect his own comfort. That is the story worth carrying away from New Harbor. Long after the champagne stains have faded from the harbor room's marble floor, long after Luke Farrow's name has stopped appearing in anyone's conversation, not the poison rings, not the frozen accounts, not even the $500 million deal that made headlines for exactly one news cycle before the city moved on. Simply the reminder that every single person handed an unfair, unwanted role still retains one quiet, permanent choice. Follow the script exactly as written and become exactly what everyone already expects. Or refuse, patiently and repeatedly, until the story itself has no choice but to rewrite its ending around you instead. Adrian Blackwell chose to refuse, and somewhere behind his eyes, in a ledger only he could see, that choice finally, permanently paid off. This has been the story of the villain who refused to lose, the man who woke up inside a death sentence and built a legacy instead, not because destiny demanded it of him, but because somewhere along the way, refusal simply became the only version of himself worth becoming. New Harbor will keep telling this story for years, in dozens of different versions, most of them missing the quiet truth sitting at its center. The real twist was never the poison, the trust accounts, or the family favors changing hands across one impossible week. The real twist was always this: a man given every excuse in the world to become a monster, chose, instead, to become someone worth trusting completely. And in a city built entirely on fear, favors, and convenient old money, that single choice remains the most dangerous, most permanent legacy Adrian Blackwell ever built. Thank you for staying until the very end of this story. Adrian Blackwell woke up as a villain, and closed this chapter of his life as something the original story never once accounted for. A man who refused to lose, refused to break, and refused, above everything else, to become exactly what everyone expected of him. That refusal built a family worth protecting, an empire worth trusting, and a legacy that no ledger, fate-driven or otherwise, could ever take away from him again. The story of New Harbor's most feared name had finally, completely, become a story worth telling for an entirely different reason. And that, more than any twist, any rescue, or any poisoned ring, is exactly the ending this story always deserved. Every villain arc promises a fall. This one delivered a rise instead, quiet, deliberate, and fully earned across one impossible week. Every rescue story promises a hero. This one delivered something steadier, a man who protected people without ever asking to be thanked for it. Every family drama promises reconciliation wrapped in easy forgiveness. This one delivered something more honest, a father and son slowly rebuilding trust one difficult conversation at a time. Every business rivalry promises betrayal around every corner. This one delivered loyalty instead, tested repeatedly and proven real every single time it mattered most. That is what made Adrian Blackwell's story worth telling. From the very first slap in that hospital ward to the very last quiet conversation beside his son's hospital window. Not the scale of his wealth, not the size of his empire, not even the strange, unexplained ledger stapled behind his eyes. Simply the discipline to keep choosing correctly long after the danger passed, long after the applause faded, long after anyone was watching closely enough to notice. New Harbor moved on, the way every city eventually does, chasing its next scandal, its next headline, its next convenient villain to fear. But for the people who lived through that impossible week, the lesson remained permanent. carried quietly into every room they entered afterward. Power without discipline eventually destroys everyone it touches. Discipline without power simply survives patiently until it finally earns the power it always deserved. Adrian Blackwell earned both, the hard way, one refusal at a time, across a single week that nearly broke him, before it finally rebuilt him into someone worth remembering. This is where his story rests for now, steady, deliberate, and finally completely his own. A villain who refused the role, a father who finally learned to protect correctly, a man who woke up inside someone else's failure and built something worth keeping instead. That is the story of Adrian Blackwell, and it ends here, quietly, completely, and exactly the way he chose to write it. Somewhere in a quiet hospital hallway, a father and son had finally found solid ground to stand on together. Somewhere in a glass tower, an empire ran on trust instead of fear for the first time in decades. Somewhere in a small clinic, a nurse trained the next generation to speak clearly, without ever needing to shrink herself again. Somewhere in a police station, an officer kept doing her job exactly the same way, unimpressed by wealth and unmoved by threats alike. Somewhere in a business office, a woman who once needed rescuing had become the one everyone else looked to for direction instead. None of these people needed a system, a ledger, or a stapled warning behind their eyes to make the right choice when it mattered most. They simply chose it over and over, the same slow, unglamorous way Adrian Blackwell had chosen it himself. That, in the end, is what made this story worth telling from beginning to end. Not the wealth, not the danger, not even the strange, impossible force that pulled one man into a stranger's ruined life. Simply the reminder that every single person, given the exact same unfair circumstances, still holds the power to choose differently. Adrian Blackwell chose differently, and an entire city changed quietly around him because of it. He did not ask to wake up inside another man's tower, another man's mistakes, or another man's countdown toward ruin. Nobody ever asked for the role fate hands them. The only real choice any of us ever get is how we answer it once it arrives. Adrian Blackwell answered his with patience instead of cruelty, with discipline instead of fear, and with quiet loyalty instead of easy convenience. He turned a death sentence into a legacy, a broken family into a foundation worth protecting, and a villain's script into something entirely his own. That is the story New Harbor will keep telling in fragments at dinner parties, in headlines that never quite capture the full truth. But the people who actually lived through it know the real ending, simple and unglamorous, exactly the way the best endings always are. A man was handed a story built to destroy him. He read it carefully, understood every warning inside it, and chose, deliberately, page by page, to write something better instead. That is the quiet gift this story leaves behind for anyone listening. No one is required to become the villain a bad beginning writes for them. Every difficult day offers the same small, repeated choice Adrian Blackwell made over and over again. Refuse the easy cruelty. Choose the harder, quieter discipline instead. Let loyalty and patience build what fear never could. Adrian Blackwell woke up as a villain, and he chose, deliberately, to become someone worth remembering instead. His empire stood, his family healed, and his name finally meant something other than fear across the city he once terrorized. That was never an accident, and it was never destiny's gift alone. It was the simple, permanent result of one man refusing, again and again, to lose the way his story was written to end. And so, at last, the villain who refused became the legacy that lasted.